Live everywhere.
Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? Thursday, November 2nd, 2017. Time for another show, whether you like it or not. And I hope you do. More of you appear to be liking the show these days. I don't know whether maybe they changed their metrics and the way they measure these things over at Libsyn. The things are looking up. It's been an exciting time. Unfortunately, I think it's probably been an exciting time because it's a horrible time for the United States of America. Anyway, this morning, not too bad on the rage tweets from Donald Trump. I mean, at least he's sort of focused on something that the rest of the country is kind of focused on. He's doing it in his own scatterbrained way. He's calling for the death penalty in the terror attack in New York City the other day, which, as a private citizen screaming from the luxury penthouse of Trump Tower, who cares, right? Call Fox and Friends, get on the air in the morning and say they ought to have the death penalty, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's a controversial position to take, but who gives a good goddamn whether this fat, stupid billionaire wants to scream about this? But as President of the United States, well, now you're just tampering with the jury pool at this point, and you should probably just let the process take care of itself, except that he also spent yesterday screaming that the United States judicial system, the justice system in our country was a joke, was a laughing stock internationally. By the way, later in the day, the White House vehemently denied that he had ever said any such thing, even though, of course, he said it on television. It was videotaped. Everyone saw it. They could play the videotape back for them, but they just stood there and flatly denied that he had said it because that's where we are in America today. Anyway, it could be worse, right? He could be out there screaming about football still at this point. At least he's sort of on the same page with the rest of America. Anyway, we probably won't pay quite as much attention to what he's rage tweeting this morning. There are plenty of other stories to follow up with. There's lots of Trump-Russia stuff to follow up with. Lots of, if not information about what's actually in the tax bill, lots to talk about the tax bill anyway, including the fact, apparently, it's being reported that Donald Trump, branding genius, has decided he wants to, his contribution to the tax cut bill is going to be naming it. And guess what he's going to name it? By now you would have seen it already. It's not going to be a surprise to you unless, I don't know, if you missed it, I guess have a seat and just be prepared. He wanted to call it, because he's such a branding genius, the Cut Act. Presumably, I didn't lose my signal there. I'm just stunned into silence. Presumably because it cuts. And he wants people to know that. And it's not, there's a lot of cuts in here act. It's the Cut Act. They were not too keen on it on the Hill, where they are not exactly renowned for their own branding genius. Many of you who are very long-time listeners or who have been readers since before there was a podcast, when I used to write, for instance, the Today in Congress feature over at Daily Kos and the now defunct, the dearly departed Congress Matters blog, remember perhaps the bananas scale, the bad acronym naming and nomenclature. I can't even remember what I used to call it. I'm trying to spell out bananas, but just rating things on a scale of, I don't know, whatever scale I made up that day, and how bananas the acronym was. What did I say was a bad acronym and nomenclature? I can't even remember what I used to call it. All right. Well, at any rate, see, that's how bad my what was it? It's not anagrams. It's, why am I blanking on what they call it? It's Anna something. You remember that. Anatoly Gershon. I don't know. You'll remind me of it. I'm blanking out. On the radio, you blank about these things. Anyway, that wasn't it. The Cut Act would at least have been the CCC Act, or KA for short. Didn't go over very well. I don't know what they're actually going to call it. It doesn't matter. Who cares? We don't even know what's in it. We're going to see the old switcheroo. I did see by yesterday afternoon that people were saying what I had told you in the morning, which was that they were likely to pull the old switcheroo on us here. Today was the day, I guess they moved it to today, or was it always today? That they were going to release the text of the bill, and they still didn't know what was going to be in it. But don't worry, I said, because they'll just release some garbage, and then they got another couple of days to work on what they think is going to be the real bill, and then they'll just pull a switcheroo and call it a complete substitute and bring something entirely different on the floor. And then by the afternoon, it turns out that, the newspapers were reporting such a thing, although I didn't get a timestamp on the release of the New York Times article reporting it. It may actually have come out before I actually said this on the air. I'll have to admit, the newspapers scoop me quite a bit. They have a whole reporting staff, and they know what they're doing, all that kind of stuff. But I did see Brian Beutler writing about it in the afternoon, explicitly saying, hey, they're going to do the same play they did with the health care bill. And you knew that because we discussed it in the morning, and today is another morning, and we're going to discuss it again because Greg Dworkin is here. This is the segment we call the Greg Dworkin Act. Good morning, Greg. I'll just call you Greg once, but I just want everyone to know you're here.
Cut. So it's the bad acronym naming and nomenclature assessment scale.
Thank you. All right. There we are.
Acronym.
Yes, thank you. All of those things. What is the word for the group of other words that I would use within a certain taxonomy that's commonly understood in a geographic region usually? I can't remember the word sometimes for things like that. I don't know. It's a common tongue that we all speak. Whatever. Anyway, it'll come to me later. But I sometimes lose control of those things. Anyway, what the hell's going on? There's a lot of big stories today.
There's a ton, but, there's always a ton. So here's the thing. The tax bill was supposed to have leaked yesterday. It was supposed to have been presented yesterday, Wednesday.
Leak.
But they couldn't because they couldn't agree on a lot of stuff. And in the process of not agreeing,
yes,
they lost a day when there's only like 10 days to do this.
Yeah, we're low on time.
Schedule.
Time is of the essence.
Right. You blew it act. So, here's a piece from, the Daily 202. That's the, Washington area code.
Today
that
is
was
the
put together by James Homan, this morning. And the big idea, he says, is, there's a lot of red state Democrats who would be happy, like Sherrod Brown, Joe Donnelly, people who might be up for re-election who would be more than happy, John Tester, to participate in tax cuts for their constituents. So they're laying down their markers of, gee, Mr. President, I would work with you on this if you would only do this, not to decrease taxes for the 1%, but rather give us tax breaks for the middle class, the people you say that you are reporting. Okay. And they're all eager to do this. And, of course, the Republicans want no part of it. They want to write their own bill. And so the Hastert rule of we're only going to do stuff within our own party is apparently a Senate thing now because there's no such thing as cooperation. One of the really interesting things about watching the development of this particular tax bill is that if, in fact, this fails, and it may, then that'll be healthcare that failed because they try to do it strictly on party lines, and then the tax thing that they tried to do strictly on party lines. And yes, they played the rules, and they did the reconciliation thing so that they would only need 50 Republican votes, but those might, in fact, be hard to come by.
Yes.
So it'll be really interesting to see how that happens.
Yeah. Now, the tax cut bill, I mean, I don't...
So they were supposed to do it yesterday, but they didn't have the votes. They couldn't agree on what to do, so they delayed it. Now it's supposed to come out today.
Okay. All right.
All right. But I'll tell you, and this is what's nice in the roundup here, and I have a big segment that I pasted and put there for you, is what Homan calls a rocky rollout. Pretty bad press. In the major daily newspapers, the Hill Rags and the financial press, and on broadcast television, Trump has told senior congressional leaders he wants to name the forthcoming tax overhaul the Cut Act. They're talking more about the name than they are the substance. Realtors launch blitz to block GOP tax proposals. That's in the Wall Street Journal. GOP goes with global flow, tax people, not companies. New York Times is math problem bedevils Republican tax rewrite. It's pitting businesses against individuals, which is a good way for Democrats to run, by the way. Politico, Republican tax writers could be heard speaking in raised voices Tuesday night during a more than 2-hour meeting at the Capitol. That's when they delayed it a day. Conservatives lament retention of top tax rate in GOP plan, but the wealthy still reap big benefits. That's the LA Times. Bloomberg, GOP braces for all hell to break loose when the tax bill finally drops. Reuters, Trump tax plan stumbles on local tax deduction, 401k. Associated Press, Republican New York Senate leader slams GOP federal tax cut plan. Financial Times, Trump throws healthcare into Republican scramble on tax plan. That bit is that Trump wanted to include repealing the individual mandate.
Right, yes, okay.
I mean, this tax bill is hard enough to pass as is. Then he throws something that's guaranteed to lose 3 or 4 Republican senator votes.
Okay, that's probably unwise for him, but I'm good with it.
It's probably unwise for him, so he did it. Business Insider, the rocky start for the Republican tax reform bill is a troubling sign of things to come. Washington Examiner, notice these are not all liberal rags here. Battle over loopholes, still hobbling GOP's tax reform rollout.
Okay.
And then the individual columnists who pick up on it. Time Magazine op-ed by Lee Price and Steve Quick. We worked on tax reform under Reagan. The Republican plan is a corporate sellout. Plumline Paul Waldman, don't buy the latest spin. The GOP tax plan is a huge giveaway to the rich. And right turns Jennifer Rubin. Republicans' tax plan so far can't pass the lab test. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. We know that the Wall Street Journal NBC News poll that just came out this Sunday found that only 25% thinks the tax bill is a good idea, and that's before they try to sell it or attack it or know what's in it.
Yes, that's true.
So you're starting from a pretty bad place. Politico Morning Consult poll published yesterday showed 48% supporters somewhat support a tax bill, but sentiment dropped sharply when people are asked about some of the specifics. Yeah, I want tax relief, but not this.
Okay.
So Gallup found that 51% of Americans feel that taxes are too high. Duh. In 1985, it was 63%, though.
Okay.
So what is the pent-up desire on the part of the public to do this bill? It's not there. It's donors.
Yes. Well, the people who have enough money that they're giving it away are concerned about what's happening to their taxes. Okay. That makes some sense.
It's actually in the bill, and then we'll have to see what kind of reaction we get. It's not a guarantee that it passes. If it does not, perhaps we go back to regular order.
Maybe.
And Republicans are more willing to openly talk about how Trump's a jerk.
Well, that's good.
So you get good benefits out of it.
Yeah.
Plus,
there are some.
Self not passing, which is a terrible thing if it did pass.
Plus, I was going to say people will take notice, but they won't. For all the people who have been saying for all this time, well, reconciliation is something you can only use once a year. You're about to see it used twice in the same year. But arguably it wasn't, actually. Budget. Yeah. It wasn't actually brought to fruition the first time. It was authorized under a different budget resolution. All the nuance that gets you past the pat statement. Oh, it can only be used once a year because that's all I've ever seen.
Nuance.
Yeah.
That's like, assuming process is important.
Yeah, I know. We'll say it here and then, we'll, I don't know. The show will be canceled.
All right. I got some nuance right here. Okay. I got some nuance for you.
Okay. I got it in a bag.
Right. I got it right here. And this is a really lovely piece by, by Matt Glassman.
Bad guy.
Political scientist.
Okay.
And he's writing in a blog. It's called legbranch.com. It's just
blog. That's crazy.
Blog.
Crazy people use blogs.
All right. So here's the title. No, congressional Republicans are not carrying Trump's water. And he goes on to amplify some of the arguments we were talking about the other day when I was on the show about the fact that you can't just assume that Jeff Flake, who is going to oppose Trump, is therefore going to vote differently than Jeff Flake would otherwise vote. Because if you're a conservative Republican, you're a conservative Republican, even if you oppose Trump. And he fleshes this out a little bit.
Okay.
He's talking about Corker and Flake, and it's a combination of, on the one hand, what are your expectations? Remember, if all else fails, lower your expectations. And the other is, what's it really mean in terms of supporting Trump if you happen to vote with him. And he explains. He says, here I consider 5 aspects of roll call voting that cause problems for measuring party support and presidential legislative effectiveness. First, the universe of roll call votes isn't random. There's a selection bias as to which bills are brought to the floor.
Okay.
In the modern age, parties have tended toward working out their differences on legislation prior to taking it to the floor. That's why the tax bill is coming out today and not yesterday. Consequently, parties tend not to bring up bills that are going to fail. That's why it didn't come out yesterday. That bill would have failed. The failure of and that doesn't bode well for today's bill. The failure of ACA repeal on the Senate floor this year was a very rare exception. Usually it doesn't go to the floor and then fail because they were counting on McCain, and nope.
It's less rare, but okay.
But it's not unknown. Right. In a narrowly divided and partisan Senate, which this is, the GOP leadership is mostly only going to allow votes on bills that virtually their entire caucus supports.
Yes.
It's a variation of the Hastert rule. And the Hastert rule in the House was you have to have a majority of the majority. And in the Senate, you have to have a majority, because otherwise what's the point?
Yes.
If the congressional GOP strongly disagrees with the president on legislation, therefore, you're not going to have roll calls data on it because it's not going to come up for a vote.
Right.
So the data does not include the 11 nominees, for example, who have been withdrawn from judicial nominees, some of whom almost certainly failed because they didn't have the votes.
True.
So you don't see the votes that failed, you only see the votes that succeed, and that's because failure is behind closed doors, and therefore it skews counting the percentage of votes that you went with one person or another person. And that's a valid point.
That is a valid point. However, you can count those. He
count
did 11. There they are.
Yeah. Second, the ideological overlap of the president and congressional co-partisan guarantees significant roll call vote support correlation. What does that mean? Look, this is a fancy way of saying you wouldn't expect GOP senators to suddenly oppose longstanding party policies such as tax cuts just because a president agrees with them. That highlights the awkwardness of the support the president frame for analyzing roll call votes. If both the president and the majority congressional party have the same ideologic position on a roll call vote, it's not clear whether legislators are supporting the president or the president is supporting the legislators. You can't tell who's leading who.
That is also a valid point.
It's silly to argue, for example, that the Affordable Care Act repeal is a presidential policy that congressional members are supporting. The congressional GOP was doing this before Trump ever got here. So to say that Flake or Corker voted with the president on ACA repeal is simply to say that they both have the same position, which is neither surprising, useful, or, in any other way revealing.
True.
Because they were going to vote, if it were some other guy besides Trump, they'd still vote for it.
That
was my point about Jeff Flake being a conservative Republican. You can't expect him to vote other than what he is. And that's not a measure of whether you support somebody or not.
That is a great explanation of that point. And it makes a lot of sense. And I'm reminded along the way, it's foolish ever, really, to think that if someone is voting for ACA repeal, that they are on board with the president's policies because this particular president doesn't have any policies. But that's
right, exactly.
That's a different point. But yeah,
and that'll
true.
Be one of the points here. So that's an excellent observation. The third, roll call votes tell you nothing about the substance of the policy. Since the votes taken on the floor of the House and Senate are a subset of the overall political agenda, a key decision for congressional leaders is deciding which agenda items will be brought up for roll call vote and which won't. So, one way to not support the president's agenda is to not consider it. If policies the president would like to pursue are not brought up for votes, they won't show up in the roll call. One difficulty in arguing GOP senators always support the president's agenda is that the agenda to date has largely been a failure. Little has passed because little has been voted on.
Right, true.
And they don't reflect the size of the policy agenda. If you think of the overall Trump agenda as a denominator, the fraction of support the congressional GOP has given the president drops a lot. They've declined to take up immigration restrictions, protectionist trade policies, infrastructure development. His one concrete proposal this year, the fiscal year 2018 budget, that included deep cuts across many federal non-defense agencies, has been ignored. On the other hand, both chambers did vote on the Russia sanctions bill that restricted the president's authority. So which ones come up is as important as how you voted on it by a percentage. 4th out of 5, roll call votes don't tell you who crafted the complex legislation. Roll call votes are binary choices. You get to vote on the final bill.
Yes.
Right? You do your vote of Robin, you do the other stuff, but a lot of that's for show. Such decisions may be predominantly driven by congressional actors or administration actors. As with the choice of issues, if underlying policy choices are driven by the priorities of congressional actors, then the president isn't leading, he's following, and he's acquiescing to them. And we saw that with Trump saying, well, it's up to Paul Ryan to pass this stuff.
True.
And the president's apparent disinterest in policy just magnifies that. So these roll call votes aren't supporting the president. These roll call votes are supporting Congress. And that's how it's pitched to congressional members, by the way.
Well, yeah, okay. I mean, I do think that there's a point in that. On the other hand, I mean, the few measures that we do have, I think people have the impression that they will essentially stay on board with the Trump agenda when they say things like, hey, if the president fires Robert Mueller, what are you going to do? And they say, it's his prerogative, whatever, I don't know. He might be rigging the whole system anyway. That's where it becomes quite obvious. So, yeah, it's not roll call votes don't necessarily tell you all that much.
That one vote is way outweighs all the others put together.
Yes,
You're absolutely
there
right.
is that.
So you can't just so they're not all equal. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, the roll call vote correlation doesn't reflect the dynamic effect that roll call votes have on presidential proposals. This is most clear in regard to nominations. If it's true that the Senate has voted almost uniformly for Trump nominations that have reached the Senate floor, that means that Trump is selecting nominees that the Senate's going to approve.
Yes.
So if Trump, who has no knowledge whatsoever of the judiciary branch, goes with judicial appointees that McConnell suggests,
yes,
and then the Senate votes to support those, that's more Trump following the Senate than it is Senate following Trump. So again, a lot of this stuff is you can't look at it and say, well, look at how they support Trump. Well, of course they did. It was their idea and Trump did it.
Yes.
Of course they're going to support it.
True. If it is their idea. There's also the possibility of what can we do to garner favoritism from the president? Let me scour the ranks in my state where we need a judicial appointment made and check out his finance committee for the state and select a top Trump donor who has no expertise in this area, but we have a job opening, and I'll suggest that person be nominated, and Trump will say, I'll happily follow your lead on that. There is that as well. But
there is, but for the most part, the point that he's making here is that it's just not that common for the Senate to outright oppose what Trump is doing on a floor vote. The Senate sanctions against Russia is a rare exception to that.
Yes.
What normally happens is Trump suggests something and then the Senate ignores it, and so it never comes to a vote in the first place. And so for that reason, and whether it's nominees or whether it's policy, it's just that although it's appealing, it's not really satisfying to use the percentage of times you voted with the president as a measure of where you were really at. And that's why if a corker or a flake makes a big splash with the statements about Trump's qualifications and so on and so forth, you can't just turn around and say, yeah, but look how they voted. That's apples and oranges.
Yes. Well, yeah, I guess that the comparison is not a good direct one. However, like with apples and oranges, I'll borrow from my big fat Greek wedding and say, well, if the topic is fruit, I have something to tell you.
They're all fruit. I get that. But they really are different. If we're going to talk about nuance, and that's what we do on this show,
right,
then the nuance is important.
Sometimes. I just have to say that because it's nuance.
When it agrees with my point, it's really important. When it doesn't, I'll just look at the overall big picture.
Yeah. There's all
that's the way pundits do it. I
like
like doing it that way.
I would say that this article probably, in the main, describes how most, I should say, overall, in every point that he made, it describes how things in the main do operate. And so that's going to capture the vast majority of all the situations, which means it was well done and points are well taken. Are there exceptions to the rule? Yeah.
Sure.
That's the way rules go.
Absolutely. In fact, you can read the article, nod your head, and say, yeah, but if it's a Mueller vote that comes up in Congress for some reason, then all that goes out the window. Then everything's on the table in terms of that vote. Just like, let's say, for the theoretic sake of impeachment.
Okay.
Right? if the vote to impeach comes up in the House,
yes,
then, all these theoretical articles about percentages don't make any difference. It's what did you do on that vote?
Right. That's true. And at that point, you could read this article, nod along with it, say that's absolutely right, hold the vote, and find out that when push comes to shove, and you were managed to define adherence to the president's agenda in one roll call vote. They do all stick with the president after all. Oh,
or they don't, depending upon what comes out.
Well, right, but I mean, if it were to go one way or the other, I mean, the whole article, I guess you still can't.
I just like to put it in an optimistic way. See, if they vote to impeach the president, then you can throw out their whole other record, right?
Yes, I suppose that's true. Although it would be nice to then go back and repeal all those laws that he signed. But okay, we don't have that in the Constitution.
Right. So let's look at something else here. The one thing that's making the rounds here, Vanity Fair has done some incredible reporting this cycle here.
They are very
partly because Gabe Sherman is there.
Oh.
You can't go any lower. Inside the West Wing, Trump is apoplectic as allies fear impeachment.
Oh.
After Monday's indictments, the president blamed Jared Kushner in a call to Steve Bannon, while others are urging him to take off the gloves with Robert Mueller. Now, how would you know that the president blamed Jared Kushner in a call to Steve Bannon?
Steve Bannon or Jared Kushner told you?
Probably Steve Bannon.
Yeah.
And so if Steve Bannon tells you that doesn't make it true, but as Rick Wilson points out, who cares? This is a fantastic story. I love it.
I'll take it. That's
whether it's true or not. I'll just, this is fantastic. I'll go with it.
Yeah, I'll accept it. It's a good story. I guess Steve Bannon is desperately trying to make himself out as a behind-the-scenes puppeteer, kingmaker. I don't know which. I don't know whether it works, but it does make for good comedy.
Trump talks to Steve Bannon. He doesn't talk to Gary Cohn or any of his cabinet members.
That's true. I wonder what they talk about. Putting acid in hot tubs.
Jared Kushner.
I guess so. That's the answer. We'll be back with more answers after this. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show on Netroots Radio. We are still here with Greg Workin and everybody. All my workmen came in this morning. Had to just start the show and leave the door unlocked and hope that the people that wandered in the morning were all the people I expected and no one else. And so far, so good. So that's good. Steve Bannon did not make his way into the building today, and that's always good news. Let's see. All right. So, Greg, are you still with us?
We are, I hope.
Okay, excellent. Then what the hell else is going on?
Well, I got this other snippet here from Vanity Fair. It's just such a good article. Here, for example, Trump, meanwhile, has reacted to the deteriorating situation by lashing out on Twitter and venting in private to friends. He's frustrated that the investigation seems to have no end in sight. Trump wants to be critical of Mueller, one person who's been briefed on Trump's thinking says, which is to say maybe John Barron. He thinks it's unfair criticism. Clinton hasn't gotten anything like this. And what about Tony Podesta? Okay. You look at this and you scratch your head and say, what is he talking about?
Yeah.
He did stuff. It's up for discussion. Mm-hmm. And this is like the most classic example of whataboutism.
Yes.
Ever. Oh, what do you mean I killed that guy and I blew up this place and I launched missiles and stuff? What about Clinton?
Right. Yeah, I mean, maybe that would be the defense.
Cares about Clinton. This is what you did, bud. Okay? According to two sources, Trump has complained to advisors about his legal team for letting that Mueller probe progress this far. Speaking to Steve Bannon on Tuesday, Trump blamed Jared Kushner for his role in decisions, specifically the firings of Mike Flynn. Like that was I'm not sure whether he's complaining that Kushner advised firing Flynn or Kushner advised hiring Mike Flynn. And the firing of James Comey, which we know Kushner advised Trump to do, that led to Mueller's appointment, according to a source briefed on the call. When Roger Stone recently told Trump that Kushner was giving him bad political advice, this is the fun part, Trump agreed, according to someone familiar with the conversation. Jared is the worst political advisor in the White House in modern history, Sam Nunberg said. I'm only saying publicly what everyone says behind the scenes at Fox News, conservative media, the Senate, and the Congress.
Okay. That's only that.
That covers a lot.
Small circle. Okay.
Yeah, that was a great line there.
Wow.
So, this sense of urgency, and that's what this describes here. Meanwhile, Governor Terry McAuliffe, governor of your state,
Yes.
says that if we find any U.S. citizen was involved in Russian hacking, it's treason.
Oh. Okay.
And the AP
What?
says Russia hackers had targets worldwide beyond the U.S. election. Sent you a little GIF of phishing links.
There goes the rest of the show. Yeah.
And basically, you can see that most of the phishing links that were sent by a group called Fancy Bear is all on Moscow time. It's like 9 to 5 Moscow time when a lot of this stuff happens.
Yeah, that's true. A lot happening in Russia. Oh, I see. Okay, I see the quote now. If any U.S. citizen was involved in this, it's treason.
Yeah, any U.S. citizen is treason.
They were involved in it, and
so it's treason.
Yeah. Oh well, that was the Trump campaign.
U.S. prosecutors considered charging Russian officials in DNC hacking case. At least 6 Russian government officials are identified as part of the ongoing investigation. That's a story in the Wall Street Journal. So between U.S. prosecutors considered charging Russian officials and the AP data on where the hacking came from, it's like this whole talking point about there was no hacking the election by the Russians is like a dead talking point.
Yeah, well, that's just at this point. Although there was a little bit of discussion about it on Twitter yesterday, but I mean, so far it's been confined to the usual suspects, I guess. Michael Tracy was going on at some length last night about how Twitter was, had switched, it was hiding the ball, essentially, in their testimony before the investigative committees.
They all
Congress.
A lot of those Facebook ads were released. Have you seen some of them?
I have seen some of them. I don't know.
Did you see the one with Jesus arm wrestling with Satan?
I did, and I was not sure what was so sophisticated about that ad. But
it wasn't. It was just weird. But you look at that and you go, okay. And then the tagline there is, if you want to vote for Jesus against Clinton, click here.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, let's just be straight out about it, right?
I
wonder why evangelicals wound up supporting Trump so much.
I did not recognize that Jesus, by the way. That was a very
muscular Jesus.
Super. Well, he wasn't even that particularly muscular. He was a very metrosexual Jesus, I thought. But whatever. They do tend to lighten them up.
The point is that you're talking about Facebook and those sorts of things reaching 185 million people. The idea that it was only a couple of $1,000 and therefore nobody really saw it. Everybody saw it.
Yes. Well, there's a couple of things that are being swapped out and conflated here. Some of which I think are important, and others of which I think are less important. The more important of the two that I can think of immediately are talking about ads versus other, I guess what they would call organic content. I mean, if you have a Russian troll farm, the fact that they come up with ads is interesting, but far more interesting is
paid stuff.
Yeah.
But it's like on Twitter, it's not that those trolls and the bots,
right?
Different things. Somebody's Jim Himes, the congressman from the neighboring district, asked in Congress, what's the difference between a troll and a bot?
Is it a riddle?
The obvious answer is like trolls turn to stone in daylight and bots are computer generated. They're different things.
Well, they are different. Did he not get it, or was he looking for somebody just to state on the record?
You never know because it's Congress, right? But that's the quote that's going around. But the point is that all the accounts that tweet stuff that happen to be Russian connected, those aren't ads.
Right.
But they increase reach tremendously.
Yes.
And so whether you're talking about ads or whether you're just talking about content that was placed for people to see, it really doesn't matter anymore. And of course the ads are paid for and you can track how much money is paid for it, but the content doesn't have to be paid for and it's still important, maybe even more important. Yeah.
Well, they're not paying Twitter to promote it, but I guess it's still paid content if you're just paying people to come up with it, but that's a slightly different story.
You're not paying Twitter. You're not paying Facebook.
Right. The other thing that I saw, that was, or I guess what Michael Tracy was talking about when he was discussing, he correctly identified some conflation that was going on also, but I think he made too much of it and then he jumped to his own strange conclusion. But there's a lot of confusion between, and some confusion about whether or not it matters, whether there's confusion about whether the content ads or organic was directed by the Russian government or just some bunch of Russians. And one of the difficulties, of course, is that it might not make very much difference.
No, but it'll be interesting to see who gets charged in the Russian government if that report from the Wall Street Journal is true.
Right.
That ends that.
It does. Although yesterday's it was very weird. He had come to this conclusion that all of the testimony that had been offered, at least from Twitter, if not from everybody else, was invalid and gave no insight to anything because they were trying to say this was the Russian government doing it, except that they really weren't trying to say that, and they studiously avoided saying that.
Right. And in fact, that's why they concentrate so much on what they call cutouts. Yes. But you know what? I think a pro tip here is if you assume Michael Tracy's wrong, you won't be confused by what he's saying.
I guess so. I was trying to deal with him on the level, but there were lots of people admonishing me that was a waste of time also. But
they are correct. Yeah. Anyway, here's another piece on the Mueller and Manafort thing. Betsy Woodruff is reporting this morning in the Daily Beast that there's a particular Manafort link in the indictment to organized crime, which I think is something you've alluded to on the show. So yes. I thought you might find this interesting.
American, Italian, Russian,
Trump's former Russian mobsters. Trump's former campaign manager didn't just do business with accused gangsters. One of them transferred millions into a Manafort account, allegedly used for money laundering.
Okay, which one?
And this would be a fellow named Semyon Mogilevich.
Have we come across this guy? Probably.
That I don't know. Frequently described as the most dangerous mobster in the world, currently believed to be safe in Moscow. He is, according to the FBI, responsible for weapons trafficking, contract killings, and international prostitution. In 2009, he made the Bureau's 10 most wanted fugitives list.
Our Bureau?
Yeah. This indictment strongly indicates the existence of a previously unknown relationship between an alleged Russian organized crime leader and Mr. Manafort. Martin Schill, retired criminal investigator for the IRS, told the Daily Beast.
Okay, he's still Mr. Manafort. He's got mob ties.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
And then they go through the connections here, so I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yes.
And then I have to run, but before I do, I just have to remind you and others that there's this election coming up in Virginia for governor.
You're telling me.
And it'll be next week, and you are probably inundated with all these ridiculous ads.
Yeah, and I can't answer the phone.
And Democrats being Democrats, I see that people are already talking about how Ralph Northam lost the election because they didn't do what I told him to.
Okay.
And, of course, he's ahead in the polls and he hasn't lost, but that's okay. We're Democrats.
Yes. Well, we do tend to screw things up. As a matter of fact, that's also one of the big stories this morning. Did you see the Politico story on Donna Brazil's book?
Yes, I did.
Okay, we have things to sort out there as well.
Yes, and there's also a profile of Nancy Pelosi, which I sent you, which I thought would be interesting as well. I mean, as somebody put it, 2016 is never going to go away.
No, it was a weird year. A bit of a perfect storm situation went on there, and, people should be studying it for a long time to come.
Mm-hmm. So we have that. The Nancy Pelosi piece is also in Politico, and I just have this one paragraph I pulled from it, the pull quote for me. Pelosi's heard it all. I say to my colleagues, you can't let the opponents choose your leader, she tells me. They're saying you're from San Francisco, you're too liberal, you're this, you're that. LGBTQ, you passed the Affordable Care Act, and they painted you the way they did, and I said, that's the reason for me to step aside. Now, I'm very proud of the Affordable Care Act, and I'm proud of my district. But even with a Midwestern Tom Daschle, the Republicans went after him as leader. They always go after the leader.
They have to go after the leader.
I know. So it's just a reminder.
Good
that,
point.
If we replace Nancy Pelosi, they'll stop picking on it. Come on, that is not how it works.
Right. That's definitely true. And, and part of the reason that San Francisco is the target that it is, part of it's cultural, but part of it is because that's where Nancy Pelosi is from. They would hate, Peoria if that's where the leader was from.
Right. Meanwhile, just to
Chicago.
throw this last piece before I go, Donald Trump's at it on Twitter again.
Good. Yeah.
He writes, New York City terrorist was happy as he asked to hang ISIS flag in his hospital room. He killed 8 people, badly injured 12. Should get the death penalty.
Oh.
And as people pointed out, the president has just placed his thumb on the scales of justice. This public comment will be used to show how the driver can't get a fair trial. Either way the trial judge rules on issue, this interjects error in multiple appeals Well done, brainless one.
Yay. Yeah, he's pretty dumb. He still thinks he's just private citizen, Joe Schmo, billionaire, maybe.
Biddy from the Bronx, first time, long time, calling in. Here's my opinion. I think you should get rid of that quarterback. He's terrible. And I'm telling you, I could do a better job myself. In fact, I think I will. I'll run on the field and I'll show you. That's what I'll do.
And then he did, and then we let him. That's the weird part. We gave him the ball. Why do we do that? Well, it was a Statue of Liberty play. I didn't realize it was him coming around to take the ball. That was another thing that came up last night on Twitter. I was just reminding everybody, this is like a right-wing call-in radio show where we took the caller and accidentally made him president. And
my long national nightmare is not going to end until he's gone.
Right.
And with that, I will leave you. There's also other stuff floating around. I guess Stan Greenberg, the Democratic pollster, has done some polling and said Democrats can't win unless they come up with their own plan. You can't just run against it.
Right.
It's very difficult to do that when you don't have the House, the Senate, or the White House, and people don't cover you. You could have a plan, and in fact they do. You don't know about it because nobody's talking about it, because they're talking about the fact that Trump's going to be indicted. This is not actually a bad thing for Democrats. It's a good thing for Democrats that all people are talking about is that Trump's people are being indicted. And when you get closer to the election, we'll see how that goes. I think it'll be a much better discussion to have on next Tuesday and Wednesday when I'm back on the show. I'm here Monday, but Tuesday's the election in Virginia, and then back on Wednesday. If Northam loses, that's one set of things to talk about, and if he wins, it's a completely different set of things to talk about. And in fact, talking too prematurely about who has messaging when people aren't running yet, and you don't know who's running against what, is, agenda stuff.
Yeah.
We're not winning because you're not talking about my agenda.
Right. I have a book on why Americans.
A group that hired the pollsters to talk about their agenda.
That is true.
Keep in mind.
Right. I mean, that's actually the playbook. Off years, you pull out the file. What to do when there's not a presidential or midterm election going on, and you're a pollster and nobody's hiring you for the moment. And part of the answer, one of the plays is do this. The other, of course, is write a book claiming to identify the key new demographic. Poll those people and say nobody is addressing the needs of this brand new demographic. Of course, that could be because no one ever thought of that demographic.
That particular demographic, who, by the way, don't vote all that often.
Yeah, right. So next week we will find out that the key demographic is, lacrosse manager moms. If you manage the lacrosse team at the local high school, the mothers of those people are really into what? And they're the key demographic, and that's what's
right. Remember, it's not soccer moms; it's security dads. No, it's not security dads. It's this other group here that we invented because that's what we do.
Right. It's a bump stock cousins. Or, I don't know.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Got to be a family member though.
Yes.
And with that, I'll just sum up by saying it's been a pleasure being on the show. It always is. Thanks so much for having me. And however you've organized it, I don't hear the workmen in the background, so that's always a good thing. And putting the phone in the washing machine and leaving Abby outside seems to be working as well. So for those of you trying to do this at home, you can, because the way we do it, anybody can.
Right.
Take care, and I'll talk to you next week.
Okay. Thanks very much, Greg. Good start. We have plenty to work with here. Today I'm being asked, finally, it's been a while since I was asked to rate the overall quality of this call. But it's apples and oranges. Are we talking about sound quality? That's what Skype always wants to know. I thought that was an excellent call. I'm going to give it an excellent, and that just goes to show you that I am 100% in the tank for the Skype agenda with the one vote that I just cast right there. Lots of good points, things to follow up on, things to pick up on and run with. Other things in pocket. I don't know what to do. Should I go? I could go down the list of what we sort of discussed those things. There are other points, obviously, and we'll return to some of those too. Let's go on to pocket and check in with comments on the KITM hashtag. Remember that you can get your comments in front of my eyes anyway. Whether or not we make it all the way on the air with them is up to some other chance here. But use the KITM, Kagro in the Morning hashtag on Twitter, or send it to me at KagroX, Kagrox. Why that? I don't know. It's Kagro in the Morning Show. Why is it that? goofy name I picked 100 years ago when it first went online. Just go with it. And in case you were wondering what the X is doing there, just put it in there. Just I can't even tell you. Back in the day when we signed up for these goofy names, sometimes they needed a last name, and certain systems wouldn't accept your submission without one. So I didn't have one, so I put in that, and without any regard whatsoever, as a probably 14-year-old kid in the mid '80s, for what the political implications of using X as a placeholder for a last name might be. And it wasn't until probably, 2 years later that they assigned us the autobiography of Malcolm X. And I said, hey, that's problematic cultural appropriation, but will anybody realize it? We didn't know what it was then. And it was still years before we were even willing to acknowledge that there was such a thing as sexual harassment. Anyway, let's see. We're having other stories added to the queue as we speak. Well, not just stories, but good stories, this time with 3 exclamation points. Greg has this new one. What is this? HonestGraph.com. Yeah, I always love the URL. Why do people think tax reform will swing the 2018 election? If there is an actual iron law of politics, it's that few benefits are unaccompanied by corresponding costs, okay, and that trade-offs and paradoxes abound. That seems true. Hence this seemingly oxymoronic title of this blog, Honest Graft. Gotcha. Sometimes Congress does little, and voters reelect its members anyway. Sometimes it does a lot, and voters respond by rebelling. Democrats produced a series of major legislative initiatives in 2009 and 2010 and were, quote, rewarded with the enduring loss of their congressional majority. I don't know how enduring it is, really, if we're talking about less than a decade, but okay. It seems like a century. Republicans adeptly harnessed popular resentment against Barack Obama to win control of the House of Representatives in 2010 and the Senate in 2014, but that same resentment led to the rise of a troublesome Tea Party movement and the installation of an unusually popular and ineffective president as party leader. And it is that president, not their own legislative record or lack thereof, that represents the biggest impediment to the Republican electoral success in 2018. And I think that aptly states things, too. I'm agreeing with a lot of people today. How about that? All right. Onward, upward, somewhat sideways with the rest of the stories of the day. Let's see. Okay. Several major themes emerging. The substantive legislative theme, tax bill. I have a story on that. Trump, Russia. Several stories on that. And finally, maybe, or should we save it for Friday where there's more extensive discussion? I think we can fit it in. The Donna Brazile book. That really was something. She has an article in Politico. We got to discuss it, but we're bumping up against a break. Let's dive into that. I think we can cover, because it's not a huge, long article. She makes things pretty succinct for the amount of material covered and the complexity of it. I might have to read this book. And I hate reading books. But Politico magazine makes this relatively short. We might even be able to cram the bulk of it in before the break. Inside Hillary Clinton's secret takeover of the DNC. I think we should just read this with minimal comment, but we'll comment afterwards. I'm going to break that pledge almost immediately, I'm sure of it. Donna Brazile discussing her own book. It's not much of a book club, is it? But okay. When I was asked to run the Democratic Party after the Russians hacked our emails, that wasn't why you were asked, but okay. I stumbled onto a shocking truth about the Clinton campaign. Something in this, I think, for everyone. The most obvious surface reading of the material is succor for Bernie was right, Hillary rigged it, people. Deeper beneath the surface, I think there's not much here for Hillary is awesome and she's the best person ever, people. Although, I don't know. But what I took away from it, I mean, I don't know. I guess I would describe myself as, if we listen back to the show, I wonder if it bears things out. I've always considered myself to be a person who was along the lines of, I like Bernie, and I think I even like him a lot, but I don't think he makes a great Democratic candidate. But I don't know where else he's going to run. I wouldn't want him to run as an independent in all of this afterwards and split the vote three ways. That's a very poor idea. But I eventually made up my mind about who to vote for in the primaries based on, not ironically, I don't know whether oddly enough or surprisingly enough, in light of this information from Donna Brazile, I made my decision in light of who did I think would be more or less trustworthy with repairing and maintaining the state of the party. I mean, that's kind of craven in that I don't usually consider myself much of a party person. I'm not deeply involved in Democratic Party politics and machinations on the inside. I don't really. I concern myself with it from time to time when I can have something to do with it, when I can understand it or help drive something in particular, but ordinarily the stuff sickens me and I can't stand it and I stay away from it for a lot of reasons. But my chief concern, I guess, to make it as succinct as possible, since Don did a good job of it, I'm not doing a good job of it. I'm gonna hit that break. No chance of getting the story in now, but I'll get some of the top leads. But my decision was largely based on, I don't think some of the things that I like about Bernie Sanders made me think that I didn't think he was going to be a very good steward for the Democratic Party. And I thought, in all likelihood, the Democratic Party nominee would win. That was an assumption a lot of us made, and it didn't turn out to be true. I felt better about the assumption after they nominated Donald Trump, but surprisingly, we all found out that didn't work out either. But again, I think there was some perfect storm stuff going on here. There were also other factors that made it possible for him to win that I don't think would ordinarily have happened with another candidate not so hooked into how can I cheat in some way or another, though everybody's always looking for an advantage. But I thought at the time, I don't know if I believe that Bernie Sanders will do the kind of nitty-gritty, nose to the grindstone, rubber chicken circuit fundraising that it takes to keep an operation like the Democratic Party functioning. And I think that he wouldn't care if it did or not. And I'm not certain he has any reason to want to preserve it, except insofar as it might be viewed as a vehicle to keep him as president should he win the nomination and then win election. Although that's not terribly different from the way any president works with their party, and parties do become personal machines for presidents, for people who win the presidency. That's mentioned in the article. But I just thought that he would bring a special disdain for doing such things, for decent reasons. This is where he's stood on the issue of big political party fundraising, particularly from corporate donors or otherwise the 1% or rich people or what have you, for a long time. So it would be entirely consistent. So it was a good guess. And likewise, for a long time, Hillary Clinton, certainly as her detractors would have it, has been way too comfortable with big donors and corporate donors and the people who give large chunks of money, and would therefore be able to raise that money and keep the party operating as it had, if not as it should be. Those are two very different things, and you can think of them very differently. But I just thought in the short term there was a real possibility that the infrastructure of the Democratic Party, as it could be, even under the guidance of Bernie Sanders, would very quickly fall apart without the root of all evil, money. And as it turns out, there was a lot of that involved in the decision-making inside the DNC, and as it turns out, for somewhat surprising reasons, well, not surprising reasons, but it was a surprise that it happened. Essentially, Donna Brazile tells us that in taking over the reins of the party after the resignation of Debbie Wasserman Schultz, she found out that the party was financially in a shambles, and it was a huge surprise to her. And I think It would have been a surprise to a lot of people except for insiders. They did, I guess they made a tremendous effort, as you would expect they might, given what the stakes were and who the actors were, to hide that from people. And of course, it wouldn't really have done a great job, I don't think, raising money for the Democratic Party if you had gone around saying, holy cow, guess what? I just found out we're bankrupt. Although, I don't know, for some reason they seem to think that works in congressional races. Let's send emails to everybody telling our supporters how poorly we're doing and how we're getting clobbered in fundraising and how it's all doom and gloom and they need to come and save us. And everybody resents getting those emails and complains about them when they see them. So I don't know how, on the one hand, the left hand knows that doesn't actually work or help anybody, but the right hand keeps sending out those emails anyway. And I think it's because the left hand is this person and the right hand is that person, and they don't really talk to each other very often. And that's bad for operations, generally speaking. Anyway, once I realized that we were going to hit the break, even if I had started reading Donna Brazil's article, I realized I might as well make my commentary up front to try to frame things ahead of time and then talk my way all the way to the break and begin reading the article afterwards. That's what we'll do when we come back from this shorter top of the hour break, just a minute long. We'll dive into the article and I'll spend the break rounding up your comments on Twitter. Thanks, and well, hang on just a second. Break is coming right now. Welcome back from our short break here on the Kagro in the Morning Show on Netroots Radio. Let's see. When we left off, I was promising. Did you like the highly professional way, by the way, that I took us up to the break? There's no real reason why I have to speak all the way to the break. I just thought it would be funny if I made it obvious and totally unprofessional. There is a break coming now. I get to watch the clock count down. Anyway, that insider joke for you. Okay. I know we have a lot of questions on this, and I'm guessing that our friend Darwin Darko, I see he's got the call out for Armando for joining us. Unless, I see he also tagged Donna Brazil on this one. There's no chance, in case you were wondering, that Donna Brazil is going to call in to discuss things with me. I don't think. But it's possible that Armando might. However, I think we can, we'll cover things. Let's go on. I see lots of other discussion happening on Twitter about this thing. We got to give Donna her due here. And I guess one more preface. I'm not sure, and no one really is, whether what Donna has to say here is, the gospel truth about what was going on inside the Democratic National Committee. But I'll say this. In the contest for on the surface anyway, for my trust, I'm deep down too. I guess if you ask me on the spot, who do you trust more, Debbie Wasserman Schultz or Donna Brazil? I'll say Donna Brazil. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know Donna Brazil like personally or really well or anything, but generally speaking, I think she's more or less on the level. She certainly does her job when necessary to do the spinning that she's hired to do. But I don't know that that's what's going on here. We'll share it. Ready? Before I called Bernie Sanders, she begins. Dives right in. I lit a candle in my living room and put on some gospel music. I wanted to center myself for what I knew would be an emotional phone call. I had promised Bernie, when I took the helm of the Democratic National Committee after the convention, that I would get to the bottom of whether Hillary Clinton's team had rigged the nomination process, as a cache of emails stolen by Russian hackers and posted online had suggested. I'd had my suspicions from the moment I walked in the door of the DNC a month or so earlier, based on the leaked emails, but who knew if some of them might have been forged? That had been the accusation at the time, right? I needed to have solid proof, and so did Bernie. So I followed the money. That sounds like a good path. My predecessor, Florida Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz, had not been the most active chair in fundraising at a time when President Barack Obama's neglect had left the party in significant debt. That's interesting off the bat, and that probably rubs a lot of people the wrong way. It rubs me slightly the wrong way in a different way. I don't care about Debbie Wasserman Schultz very much. And I never really was even a giant Barack Obama fan either. I'm happy he won. He's certainly better than Donald Trump. He did a lot of things that I thought were important. He did a lot of things that I thought were ridiculous. But I'm not surprised by the accusation that the party was neglected under his watch, because we've entered a time, I don't know whether it's unique to Barack Obama, I doubt very much that it is, but we have entered a time when the leaders of the party, presidents, incumbent presidents as party leaders, tend to appropriate the party apparatus to themselves and make it about themselves, and then when they leave office, as they are constitutionally mandated to do eventually, we're like adrift, and the party hasn't really operated as an independent entity for a long time. It has atrophied. But there was that. I guess the other thing that rubs me the wrong way, that is not to say that it offends me, but that I am sideways with the explanation. I'm left at a loss. I thought Debbie Wasserman Schultz seemed to me was so like off kilter with where I hoped Democrats as a party would be policy wise, and struck me as such an operator that I thought, surely this must mean she's raising a ton of money somewhere. Usually the people that I find myself sideways with on policy and personality are sold to me as beneficial at the helm of the party. Despite it all, I should swallow it and allow it to go forward because they're raising a ton of money and good things can be done with a ton of money. Now I find out I was just at odds with her on policy and personality, and she wasn't raising any money. That's not good. So, I'm willing to accept that one. And the Barack Obama one, I don't know. I can't put space between myself and those. I'm more surprised about the Schultz thing than the Obama thing, but I'm not terrifically surprised by either one. Except for maybe I am terrifically surprised that there was no money and Debbie Wasserman Schultz wasn't raising it. I wonder if she'd dispute that. I have a feeling she would. But I think anybody would, even if it wasn't true. As Hillary's campaign gained momentum, she resolved the party's debt and put it on a starvation diet. It had become dependent on her campaign for survival, for which she expected to wield control of its operations. Two moving parts in this one. Good that you resolve the party's debt. Bad that the diet you put it on is described as starvation diet, if that's an accurate way of putting it. And on the other hand, or not the other hand, but I guess also, I guess if you resolve the party's debt, it's going to end up dependent on you for survival. That seems pretty obvious, and it's something you should probably have sought to avoid. But I guess if you're dying and somebody friendly to you, generally speaking, and who you expect to take over the reins of your apparatus anyway, whether you rig that in their favor or not, without touching that question, if you expect them to be the person that's taking charge eventually of your apparatus, it's not the worst situation you could find yourself in if you're going to die otherwise. But what a horribly irresponsible place to have left the party apparatus, that they would get into the situation where the deal that they end up signing seems like a good one, or a good option. That's bad news. We'll get to that in a minute. I should keep reading. Debbie was not a good manager, Donna writes. She hadn't been very interested in controlling the party. She let Clinton's headquarters in Brooklyn do as it desired, so she didn't have to inform the party officers how bad the situation was. I'm not really sure why that excuses her from doing that, but I guess she thought she could point at Brooklyn and say, that is to say, the Clinton headquarters, the campaign headquarters. And I'm not the one doing this, they are. But the more I read about what her view, anyway, of Debbie Wasserman Schultz is, the more appalled I am. She's not a good manager, and she doesn't raise money. I don't understand. Okay, so she's not interested in controlling the party. She's not interested in raising money for the party. What is she interested in doing? And I guess, I don't know. I guess somebody would say to me, well, it's a high-profile position. It does connect you to money. Maybe she was just using it. She said, I'll do the work. No one else wants to do the work. I'll do the work. Maybe I'll end up a senator from Florida instead of congresswoman from Florida. I don't think that she had any real designs seriously on, say, running for president or anything. I don't think there was any clamoring going on for that, but maybe she thought she would be a power broker. But then why not control the party? I don't know. I really don't know. I don't know how to reconcile. What is she doing there if she doesn't want to control the party and she doesn't raise any money? So I do find it a little difficult to believe that that's the case, but it's certainly not a hard sell to tell me she's not very good at either one, but don't want to. I don't know. Anyway, so moving on. By September 7th, the day I called Bernie, I had found my proof, and it broke my heart. Now, are we talking about September 7th, 2016 here? I guess so. It doesn't say. I really need a clarification. She knew already. All right. I think it's 2016. The Saturday morning after the convention in July, I called Gary Gensler, the chief financial officer of Hillary's campaign. He wasted no words. He told me the Democratic Party was broke and $2 million in debt. What? I screamed. I am an officer of the party, and they've been telling us everything is fine, and they were raising money with no problems. I would have expected that to be the case. I don't know if they would have said fine, and we're raising money, no problems. We always need more money. They're always going to say that. But, certainly she says they weren't talking about the size of the party's debt. That wasn't true, he said. Officials from Hillary's campaign had taken a look at the DNC's books. Obama left the party $24 million in debt, $15 million in bank debt, and more than $8 million owed to vendors after the 2012 campaign, and had been paying that off very slowly. That doesn't surprise me too much, but $24 million in total, I think that's surprising, I guess, right? Obama's campaign was not scheduled to pay it off until 2016. Hillary for America, the campaign, and the Hillary Victory Fund, this is important, its joint fundraising vehicle with the DNC, had taken care of 80% of the remaining debt in 2016, about $10 million, and had placed the party on an allowance. Now, you don't want to hear going into a presidential campaign that your party is on an allowance. But on the other hand, I guess if the party is on an allowance from the campaign organization behind which the party is supposed to be operating 100% in order to facilitate its victory at the November elections, again, that's not out of keeping with the way things actually work at that point in time, at the point where either the nomination is formally made or it becomes obvious mathematically, very obvious, like impossible otherwise to come out any other way mathematically. But yeah, the nominee is supposed to take the reins of the party. And she discusses this in this book discussion as well. But this is an unusual way to approach integrating the two operations. There, one could be in debt and the other not be in debt, but you integrate the operations and then you have to worry about the debt if there is some. But usually it's not the campaign being the lender operator for the party. Ideally, it's supposed to be the other way around, that the party has been raising tons of money all along and spends lots of money on the campaign. This was entirely backwards. But again, I don't know what else the Hillary Clinton campaign was going to do other than say, yeah, we'll bear the party out. And here I worry that, like, for instance, had we nominated Bernie Sanders, although there's plenty of argument here that, that would have been impossible. So here's the question, I guess. Had Bernie Sanders won the nomination through whatever mechanism, would Bernie Sanders have concerned himself with the finances of the party and setting them aright? And if he would not, Would that be a good thing? I mean, there would be, I think, plenty of Bernie Sanders supporters who would say, yeah, that's a good thing. The party's garbage, and we ought to start from scratch and burn it to the ground and build it from the ground up once again. And people would say, practically speaking, that's maybe not such a great idea. I think I'd be in the second group. Yeah, I mean, so my concern was, I didn't think it would be wise to enter the election or any period of time whatsoever at any situation with a party in shambles and a nominal head of the party with little to no interest in rebuilding it and possibly an active interest in destroying it. Not because he was against democratic principles and that he was in total disagreement with where the base of the party was. That couldn't be the case if he were nominated. And it was never the case even though he lost the nomination. But because he's just not a fan of parties in general, and this particular party, with which he has not developed any kind of relationship intentionally. Anyway, I'll continue on. Donna writes here, if I did not know about this, that is, the seriousness of the financial situation, I assumed that none of the other officers knew about it either. That was just Debbie's way, which is a little shocking. In my experience, she didn't come to the officers of the DNC for advice and counsel. She seemed to make decisions on her own and let us know at the last minute what she had decided, as she had done when she told us about the hacking only minutes before the Washington Post broke the news. On the phone, Gary told me that the DNC had needed a $2 million loan, which the campaign had arranged. No, that can't be true, I said. The party cannot take out a loan without the unanimous agreement of all the officers. Imagine being one of the officers and thinking that was true and finding out that it wasn't. Gary, how did they do this without me knowing? I asked. I don't know how Debbie relates to the officers, Gary said. He described the party as fully under the control of Hillary's campaign, which seemed to confirm the suspicion of the Bernie camp. The campaign had the DNC on life support, giving it money every month to meet its basic expenses, while the campaign was using the party as a fundraising clearinghouse. Under FEC law, an individual can contribute a maximum of $2,700 directly to a presidential campaign. But the limits are much higher for contributions to state parties and a party's national committee. Individuals who had maxed out their $2,700 contribution limit to the campaign could write an additional check for, up to anyway, $353,400 to the Hillary Victory Fund. That figure, for a breakdown, represented $10,000 to each of the 32 state parties who were part of the Victory Fund agreement. That accounts for $320,000 of the $353,400, right? And another $33,400 under FEC law could be contributed to the Democratic National Committee. $10,000 to each of the state parties, and then $33,400 to the DNC, which on the surface, again, not bad, right? I mean, consider that, you could quibble with whether or not anyone ought to be able to deliver $350,000 to a party, and there are going to be a lot of people who would take exception with that. But I given that it was possible, on the surface, the breakdown isn't bad. $10,000, if I force people to give, if you're a big donor and you want influence with us, whatever, okay, you're going to give $350,000, great, whatever. We're sad about the whole influence peddling game, but at least you structure it so that $10,000 goes to each of 32 state parties. I like it. That would be great, except that's not where the money came to a stop. This is where it becomes messier. The money would be deposited in the states first, and then transferred to the DNC, which did really need it, granted, shortly after that. Money in the battleground states, and this sounds okay too, usually stayed in that state. But all other states funneled that money directly to the DNC, which quickly transferred the money to Brooklyn. Okay, that becomes problematic. Wait, I said. That victory fund was supposed to be for whoever was the nominee and the state party races. You're telling me that Hillary has been controlling it since before she got the nomination? Gary said the campaign had to do it or the party would collapse. So That's pretty dire. If that's true, then you're stuck with a pretty strange situation. No, I mean, it wouldn't have troubled the Hillary Clinton campaign very much at all. But suppose you were a DNC official looking at it fairly from the outside. You might say, well, this is not an ideal situation, handing over control of the Democratic Party, the Democratic National Committee apparatus to Hillary Clinton, though we do expect that she will eventually gain control of it legitimately enough. Handing over control of it before the formal transfer of power, before the reason, the trigger of that formal transfer, or even informal transfer, whatever, the expected transfer, is problematic. Yes. More problematic than that, though, would, I think, arguably be the total financial collapse of that party. You don't want that to happen. But was it going to happen? Is it a straw man? I don't know. But certainly if that's the choice, if you face me with that choice and say, either you enter into this agreement, which is not particularly democratic in its values, let's say, not particularly transparent in its operation, and not very good for people who are otherwise interested in campaign finance reform and transparency. But the other option is the total collapse of this party and the loss of the White House and possibly both houses of Congress to the other party. I would say, you might convince me to take a flyer on that one and say, all right, we're going to have to do this and do it the bad way. That was the deal, Gary says, that Robbie Mook, the campaign manager for Clinton, that was the deal that Robbie struck with Debbie, he explained, referring to campaign manager Robbie Mook. It was to sustain the DNC. We sent the party nearly $20 million from September until the convention and more to prepare for the election. That would mean September 2015 through July of 2016. $20 million and more to prepare for the election. What's the, and by the way, again here, look at that's the deal struck between Robbie Mook, who's managing the campaign for Hillary Clinton, and Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who I think everybody knows was going to be a Hillary Clinton supporter, and maybe this wasn't. I mean, but who else are you going to find at the helm of the DNC? That's one of the informal part of the whole situation is, Hillary Clinton had been an active Democratic Party member for a bazillion years, and Bernie Sanders wasn't, and intentionally held himself apart from it, and that's going to create some distance between him and the formal party structure. And when you elect a chairperson, that chairperson is going to come from the person who can convince the largest number of members of the committee, who are themselves, generally speaking, people who have been a part of the formal party apparatus since forever, to vote for them. That was an institutional disadvantage that Bernie Sanders built for himself intentionally, and then found out it put him behind the 8 ball. And I don't see how you couldn't have seen that coming, but good. He made a good fight of it anyway. All right. So back to the article. What's the burn rate, Gary? I asked. How much money do we need every month to fund the party? The burn rate was $3.5 million to $4 million a month, he said. I gasped. I had a pretty good sense of the DNC's operations after having served as interim chair 5 years earlier. Back then, the monthly expenses were half that. What had happened? The party chair usually shrinks the staff between presidential election campaigns, but Debbie had chosen not to do that. She had stuck lots of consultants on the DNC payroll. True and serious problem. And Obama's consultants were being financed by the DNC too. True and problematic. When we hung up, I was livid. Not at Gary, but at this mess I had inherited. I knew that Debbie had outsourced a lot of the management to the party and had not been the greatest at fundraising. I would not be that kind of chair, even if I was only an interim chair. Did they think I would just be a surrogate for them, get on the road and rouse up the crowds? I was going to manage this party the best I could and try to make it better, even if Brooklyn did not like this. It would be weeks before I would fully understand the financial shenanigans that were keeping the party on life support. And that's an interesting way of putting it, keeping the party on life support. Like, was there an opportunity to raise it up on its own and allow it to be independent and grow, but they suppressed that ability so that they could keep this agreement in place. I mean, once the agreement is in place, isn't that enough to keep the agreement in place? You're not going to just breach that in the middle of the campaign. But, all right, maybe they overreached. Right around the time of the convention, the leaked emails revealed Hillary's campaign was grabbing money from the state parties for its own purposes, leaving the states with very little to support down-ballot races. And that was my chief concern, too, right? Like, I thought, well, will Bernie Sanders be there to build the party and therefore help fund down-ballot races? And I thought, no. I don't know that I necessarily thought that Hillary Clinton absolutely would be the best person ever for it, but I think that was the purpose of nominating somebody who was a party participant and party builder for years. Yeah, I thought that she was going to be doing that. And we knew a little bit about this at the time. The allegation was certainly made that the states were not getting what they were supposed to be getting and that the down ballot money really wasn't there. And that was a disappointment, but also not terribly surprising. Whenever lots of money is needed to do something, very often people say, oh, I'll share it with you on the way in, and then suddenly find, even truthfully find, without being greedy or graspy, find, oh my God, I need a lot more than I thought I was going to need. And since this money flows first through my hands, I'm going to squeeze off the flow down the line. Trickle-down economics doesn't work very well for anybody, generally speaking. Okay. It's bad, though. You shouldn't say, oh, well, it does happen, but it's not good when it does. Anyway, a Politico story published on May 2nd, 2016 described the big fundraising vehicle she launched through the states the summer before, quoting a vow she had made to rebuild the party from the ground up. When our state parties are strong, we win. That's what will happen. I wanted that. That line sounded good to me. I thought I should take up on that deal. Yet, the states kept less than 0.5% of the $82 million they had amassed from the extravagant fundraisers Hillary's campaign was holding, just as Gary had described to me when he and I talked in August. When the Politico story described this arrangement as essentially money laundering, oh, it's a bad time to be describing anything as essentially money laundering, for the Clinton campaign, Hillary's people were outraged at being accused of doing something shady. Bernie's people were angry for their own reasons, saying that this was part of a calculated strategy to throw the nomination to Hillary. She writes, I wanted to believe Hillary, who made campaign finance reform part of her platform. But I had made this pledge to Bernie and did not want to disappoint him. I kept asking the party lawyers and the DNC staff to show me the agreements that the party had made for sharing the money they had raised, but there was a lot of shuffling of feet and looking the other way. I'll pause here just to say, I like the approach she's taking, although I do have this question. I'm guessing that we're going to see a lot of Bernie Sanders fans saying, thank God, Donna Brazile being the hero here, telling it like it really is. And I'm wondering if what sort of reaction was there to Donna Brazile taking over at the time from from Bernie Sanders supporters? Was it generally supportive, generally neutral, or generally, oh, this isn't going to solve anything. She's just a shill for Hillary. She's going to lie and not going to look into this thing and cover up for Hillary the whole time? And are they saying, God, I was wrong, or just pointing and saying, aha, see, and not taking ownership of what they said at the time? I don't know. My guess is they're not taking ownership of what they said at the time. Not because they're terrible people, but because they're people. That's what people do. I'm probably doing it right now. Anyway, when I got back from a vacation in Martha's Vineyard, and I don't think it was necessary to say that the vacation was in Martha's Vineyard, I would have advised against it, but fine. I at last found the document that described it all, the joint fundraising agreement between the DNC, the Hillary Victory Fund, and Hillary for America. That does sound like an important document. We'll talk about that document after the next upcoming break. And, let's start our music here. Might as well start the countdown. I knew we would hit another break on this one. There's just too much to comment on in this article. It's very interesting. There's a little bit more to go, and we'll return in just 2 minutes to describe the rest of it. It doesn't really get any better, but it's important to get it out there and discuss it. Then we'll switch directions and talk about a few other things after this break. Hang on. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show on Netroots Radio. We stopped before the break in the middle of Donna Brazil's article about her own book, about her oversight of the Democratic National Committee just prior to the election in 2016 after the resignation of Debbie Wasserman Schultz. And it's alternately surprising and disappointing, of course. But a reckoning will have to be had here. And I would say this. My skimming of the rest of the article tells me that this doesn't provide resolutions to any of final resolutions to any of the lingering questions, but important information with which we might one day reach such a resolution. Anyway, by the way, one of the interesting comments to come in, and there's been a couple of interesting comments along the way. Let's see. First of all, just say hi again to Darwin Darko. He says he's listening from Japan. He's on deployment in Japan and had to stay up, and God only knows what time it is. Actually, most people in Japan know what time it is, but that's an expression. God isn't the only one that knows what time it is in Japan. I think a lot of people do, including Darwin himself, staying up to listen to this one. I'm sorry we couldn't deliver Donna Brazil for you on this one, or even Armando, but I guess he's on work deployment wherever he is. Michael Musson has this comment, though, and this is a good one. Imagine if Bernie had known at the time and given significant money to prop up the party, too. Would have been very different. That is true. I don't think that it was likely that he was going to discover that this was a pretty novel situation and a pretty novel solution, for lack of a better term. I don't think it was a very good solution at all. A novel solution to have been proposed. I thought it was at the very least, it was super clever. Maybe too clever by half and not a particularly good idea. But I thought it was clever at the time. Like, okay, well, she's got access to the money. She's a huge fundraising machine. If the party needs to be propped up, it's going to be propped up at some expense. What is going to be the trade? And, what is she after? She's after the nomination and after the presidency, and she's obviously going to make the conditions of her saving the party some furtherance of that end. I don't think that's a super big surprise. The surprise would have been if she had been altruistic and said, I just love the Democratic Party so much. But you do hope for that. But then you say, are you just too naive to be president if you believe in, like, I'll give you the money, you'll do the right thing with it? I mean, you're talking about the DNC here. I think everybody probably roll their eyes about that. Anyway, the gist of the rest, I should just get right back to it here. The agreement signed by Amy Dacey, the former CEO of the DNC, and Robbie Mook, with a copy to Mark Elias, whose name was just, of course, recently in the news as the guy who continued to make sure that, Fusion got paid to continue to work on and finish the Chris Steele dossier. Remember all of that? Anyway, this agreement specified that in exchange for raising money and investing in the DNC, and that's what's happening here, Hillary would control the party's finances, strategy, and all the money raised, which is, again, at first, a bit of an affront, a bit of a shock. Like, wait a minute, that's not supposed to happen. And it isn't. But on the other hand, what did you think you were going to be asked to do in exchange for the money, which was really just the question I was just asking. On the other hand, I'm amazed that it would say so explicitly in the agreement, but maybe it has to. From the Mook point of view here, from the campaign's point of view, it's going to have to say that explicitly in the contract, because otherwise I don't think that would be the assumption. And I guess that's the real problem here, is if the ordinary assumption in the absence of a written contract demanding something different, if the ordinary assumption would be, well, we're going to give you money, but honestly, it would just be wrong for us to demand control of every aspect of the party apparatus at a time when we were contesting the primary. If you think that should have been the default position, and ideally it would be, but I don't know how well anybody I know is going to live up to those ideals. Maybe, I guess the argument could be, well, Bernie would have, but I don't know that he would have. He might have, but I don't know that that would necessarily have been motivated by, those are my principles and I think parties suck, and so I would be scrupulous about keeping it neutral. Or would it be because I don't think parties should control anything ever? Or would it be because I don't have any interest in the way this party runs, and if it burnt to the ground, I'd be more than happy? I don't know. I will say this. That ascribes too much motive, more than I can prove, for Bernie Sanders. It's true. But on the other hand, I guess I do have some experience with Bernie Sanders as a candidate who straddles that line between caucusing with Democrats, seeking political support from Democrats, including Democrats in his base, but still not being a Democrat. We discussed it a little bit at the time. I did work for Bernie Sanders. I worked on Bernie Sanders' first senatorial race in 2006. And, I guess you'd have to say a bit player in all of it, but a little bit of a bigger bit than, stuffing envelopes. Let's say I wrote the campaign blog and I maintained the campaign blog, and I was in touch with senior-ish staff. They didn't have a gigantic staff. It wasn't a huge apparatus they had for Bernie in 2006. Running for Senate in Vermont doesn't require that big of an apparatus. But, I was in there and I had to believe in what I was doing, and I did. And I wanted him to be in the Senate, and I still want him to be in the Senate. I didn't know if I wanted him to be at the head of the Democratic Party, but there was a lot of tension involved right there and then at the time between the Vermont Democratic Party and Bernie's apparatus, the National Democratic Party and Bernie's apparatus, and as a result, in many ways, between the National Democratic Party and the Vermont State Democratic Party, too, there were a lot of people who were outside of Vermont and not 100% certain. What are we getting out of this Bernie thing? He's going to be occupying a Senate seat, and that's a damn valuable thing. Is he going, does he work well with Democrats? And who do you ask about that, right? You ask the Vermont Democratic Party about that, and the honest answer is, nah, he doesn't really. He, generally speaking, and I knew it at the time, delights in antagonizing formal party structures of both parties, and probably of other parties too. He probably hates the libertarians as well. He's just he does not love working with the party apparatus. And at the Senate level, I was okay with it because there's another layer of protection. And I use that word advisedly because it's protection in every sense of the word, including protection racket, of having the party caucuses to keep people relatively in line inside the Senate. You can go there as an independent, but the power still flows through the party apparatus, and that's maybe a bad thing, but it's also a moderating influence on people who would otherwise embed themselves in a party that they have at least some moderate interest in screwing with. Anyway, if you ask the people on the ground in Vermont who are involved in the Democratic Party, they would tell you you're stuck in terms of finding another candidate. You're not going to find anybody who's going to defeat Bernie Sanders in a primary for the Senate campaign at this stage of the game. And he'll be with you on policy, and he'll mostly vote your way in the votes that you need, just as we were discussing. You can't tell whose agenda it is with Trump and Republicans in Congress. You can't always tell whose agenda it is as between the Senate Democratic Caucus and Bernie Sanders independent. But if you're wondering, is he going to have your back in party matters, the answer is probably not. So that was a concern at the time. Anyway, where were we here? The campaign, yes. So here's the deal being struck here between Amy Dacey, Robbie Mook, copy to Mark Elias. In exchange for raising money and investing in the DNC, Hillary would control the party's finances, strategy, and all the money raised. I guess the other point I wanted to make here is, from the outside, whether Bernie Sanders is running for president at this point or not, Bernie Sanders and his supporters, and really everybody else in the world, what are you likely to see? If you had not specified that this weird deal was the case, you might assume otherwise. But if you even if you explicitly stated that it was not the case, don't you think that most people would say, oh, well, the fact that you are bailing the party out here, that you're doing all the money raising and doing all the investing in the DNC, don't you think that everybody, particularly critics, would come away with the impression or be willing to take that information and go to the public and say, that really means, though, that Hillary Clinton is in control of the party's finances, strategy, and all the money raised? As the piece continues here, her campaign had the right of refusal over who would be the party communications director, and it would make the final decisions on all the other staff. Shocking at first, but then even if it had explicitly stated that that was not the case, that would still be the assumption of critics. Sure, it says that. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But isn't it obvious that she really is in control of all those things? That's what the assumption would be, and probably because that was really what was going to be going on. When you are the sole source of the survival, the money it takes to survive, it's very likely that that's going to be the case. Still, it's a little surprising to see that in a written agreement. You might even have suggested that they hide the ball a little bit, but they didn't. I don't know whether we're supposed to give them any points for that. That's not exactly transparency. The DNC also was required to consult with the campaign about all other staffing, budgeting, data analytics, and mailings. Now here, we have the closest thing you get to evidence of what fell under the all too broad umbrella, I think, of rigging the system. It wasn't that things were rigged such that the votes were actually swapped, or you could only nominate Hillary Clinton, or we would change the rules every time in order to benefit Hillary Clinton. And a good point, among others, being made here by Dana Hool, who's not yet ready to discuss the situation, but does tweet this. There is this. If it was really rigged, if the vote and the nomination were outright rigged on that level, the caucuses would have come out a different way. Why wouldn't they have been rigged as well? But what real rigging there is look, if you control and you have the right of to veto, you have a veto right over who gets to communicate party strategy, who is on staff that will make decisions about when things happen and which state goes first and how they'll make their decisions and what are we going to do about the rules of the convention and who's going to say what to NBC News about this. You remember there was all sorts of controversy about the timing of the debates as well. It's true. I mean, that's process stuff, and we keep telling you here on this show how much importance needs to be attached to that kind of decision making. And it's true that if you get to install your people in all key positions, that's a kind of rigging. It's not the kind of vote rigging that people were making accusations about, but people were partisans, and they found something was certainly amiss, and they don't really know the internal machinations necessarily of the DNC. What they have in front of them and what they know about is voting, and in the first instance they say, well, maybe that was rigged then. As it turns out, it was. It's a bad word for it, but it gets at the heart of what was going on. It was rigged at the staff level instead. And I hate using that word, and I'll back off of it in a second if you press me on it. So don't. You can press me on it for other reasons, but I'll abandon the rigging word, for lack of a better term, in a second, and I'll just have to think of a better one. Okay, but that's pretty serious, though. I mean, it's more control than you ordinarily would turn over, even. Certainly more control than you would ever contemplate turning over under normal circumstances, and these were not normal. The party is not usually bankrupt. It's not usually the campaign propping up the party. It's supposed to be the other way around. And the fact that it's gotten the other way around, I don't know. That's indicative of the collapse of our campaign finance system, our dependence on big dollar donors. Big dollar donors, that system only works when there are superstar fundraisers, though, who agree to raise that money and at least hand some of it over to the DNC. But you can see they're not handing over everything that they should be handing over. And then you start to wonder, why do they ever think they should? If they're the ones doing all the work and raising the money off of their own superstardom, it was never the chairperson of the DNC who made that person a superstar, or very rarely, although I suppose Barack Obama owes somebody for getting that keynote speech, but then he did what he did with it. I don't know. I guess there's arguments to be made. But anyway, where were we here? The DNC was also required to consult with the campaign, who was paying for everything, about all other staffing, budgeting, data analytics, and mailings. Super sad, but I think that's everybody's point. That's what comes with money. I had been wondering why it was that I couldn't write a press release without passing it by Brooklyn. Well, here was the answer. I guess so. Here's where she explains that what usually happens. When the party chooses a nominee, the custom is that the candidate's team starts to exercise more control over the party. If the party has an incumbent candidate, as was the case with Clinton in 1996 or Obama in 2012, this kind of arrangement is seamless because the party already is under control of the president. When you have an open contest without an incumbent and competitive primaries, the party comes under the candidate's control only after the nominee is certain. However that might be determined. When I was manager of Gore's campaign in 2000, we started inserting our people into the DNC in June. This Victory Fund agreement, however, had been signed in August of 2015, just 4 months after Hillary announced her candidacy and nearly a year before she officially had the nomination. I tried to search out any other evidence, and this is important, of internal corruption that would show that the DNC was rigging the system to throw the primary to Hillary, but I could not find any in any party affairs or among the staff. I had gone department by department, investigating individual conduct for evidence of skewed decisions, and I was happy to see that I had found none. Then I found this agreement, and the agreement is bad and bad enough and troublesome, problematic. Should not do these sorts of things. Yes, she'll be given a lot of points from Bernie Sanders supporters for finding it, revealing it, discussing it frankly and honestly. But that won't be enough. Not for all of them. Certainly there will be lots of Bernie Sanders supporters who are saying, now you're lying about you searched for other evidence of corruption and you didn't find any. Or isn't this enough? And maybe it is enough. But it certainly implies that things can be, again, we're stuck with the word rigged, in favor of Hillary Clinton if all the decision makers are people that she has the right to veto. But then you got to look at what they do when they're in office. And if you were making decisions in the same way that you might have been making those decisions anyway, even if this incentive system hadn't been there, then what do? I looked. I thought I would find it because this agreement suggested I would. Then I found it wasn't there. Now you're a big liar? Well, maybe that's just what got found. Or maybe she is a big liar. The funding arrangement with Hillary for America and the Victory Fund agreement was not illegal, but it sure looked unethical. Or super clever, depending on how you look at it. If the fight had been fair, one campaign would not have control of the party before the voters had decided which one they wanted to lead. This was not a criminal act, but as I saw it, it compromised the party's integrity. And I think it does. It's problematic. Don't do it again. I hope you can avoid it. I guess it's a big if. Who knows? But this is a good point. If the fight had been fair, one campaign would not have control of the party before the voters had decided which one they wanted to lead. And I think that's key too. There still was the possibility that the voters might decide they wanted the other to lead. Now that would lead to huge problems, but I don't see how, if he had mustered more votes, and I see why it would be difficult for him to muster more votes, but ultimately the votes had to be cast by people who weren't getting a sweet, sweet taste of the Hillary graft. They may be casting their votes based on insider opinions where people were tasting that, except in most of the states, it turns out all the money was flowing the other direction. The state party leadership should have been furious with Hillary Clinton for siphoning off all that money. And if anything, insider opinion would probably be running against Hillary Clinton. Had there been perhaps another mainline Democrat contesting the election, they might have won. Maybe the rigging really was that the only other alternative candidate, I mean, discounting Martin O'Malley at this point in the race, he's gone anyway, but even early on, he wasn't generating a great deal of excitement. True. Neither was Hillary, as Donna Brazil says later on. Apparently we're sticking with this article for the rest of the show. But, you know, Bernie Sanders was a total unknown factor in all this. He got big, he got huge, but, you know, he was party insiders, despite their disappointment or all the reasons that they had to be disappointed in the state parties with Hillary Clinton, they weren't going to Bernie. Why not? I don't know, but they weren't. Was it rigging, or did they just say, you know, I'm pissed about this, but I don't believe in this guy? And if they don't, they don't. Or if, like me, they do, but they don't think that he's going to be any help when it comes to keeping the party strong. Whatever the decision-making process is, they weren't flocking to him. He didn't get more votes. Under other circumstances, he might have, and had he done it, there's no denying that the party apparatus would have been handed over to him. Whether it was a good idea or not, it would have been his. And I think that's an implicit point in that sentence, and I bet it's being overlooked everywhere. So, the exciting conclusion here, I think, I had to keep my promise to Bernie. I was in agony as I dialed him. Keeping this secret was against everything that I stood for, all that I valued as a woman and as a public servant. As a woman. Interesting. I think we might have thought it was a human being, but let's let her have it as a woman, because why not? Women should think such things too. Yes? Good. All right. I think that's interesting. But, all right. Hello, Senator. I've completed my review of the DNC. That seems like a tough way of starting. And I did find the cancer, I said, but I will not kill the patient. I'm not sure how to take what that means, actually. That's another show. I discussed the fundraising agreement that each of the candidates had signed. Bernie was familiar with it, but he and his staff ignored it. They had their own way of raising money through small donations. I described how Hillary's campaign had taken it another step. I told Bernie I had found Hillary's joint fundraising agreement. I explained that the cancer was that she had exerted this control of the party long before she became its nominee. Had I known this, I never would have accepted the interim chair position. But here we were with only weeks before the election. I don't know what would you do? You find out that the agreement is there and it's bad. I think I would accept whatever role I could to let people know, oh, I found this bad thing. I don't know why she wouldn't have accepted the chair position, but she has her own reasons. Bernie took this stoically, which is good. He did not yell or express outrage. Instead, he asked me what I thought Hillary's chances were. Good question. The polls were unanimous in her winning, but what he wanted to know was my own assessment. I had to be frank with him. I did not trust the polls, I said. That's surprising to me. I never heard her say that. I told him I had visited states around the country and I found a lack of enthusiasm for her everywhere. Certainly lots of people said that. I just said it. I was concerned about the Obama coalition and about millennials. I urged Bernie to work. I'm going to leave that right where it was. I urged Bernie to work as hard as he could to bring his supporters into the fold with Hillary. And he did do that. And to campaign with all the heart and hope he could muster. He might find some of her positions too centrist and her coziness with the financial elites distasteful, but he knew and I knew that the alternative was a person who would put the very future of the country in peril. I knew he heard me. I knew he agreed with me, but I never in my life had felt so tiny and powerless as I did making that call. When I hung up the call to Bernie, I started to cry, not out of guilt, but out of anger. We would go forward. We had to. Well, that's a bit soupy and dramatic at the end there for me, but you got to end somewhere, and this is it. And 10:54 in the hour and 54 mark in a 2-hour show is as good a place as any to stop with that. I knew we would obsess with this. There was no way around it. You had to. We might as well clean up by checking on the comments a little bit and hinting a little bit at what we're going to be getting at, I hope, tomorrow in tomorrow's show because there's so much other stuff going on. Let's see. Michael Musson making this second comment. I remember his first comment was, imagine if Bernie had known at the beginning and given significant money to prop up the party too. Now, some bits of this he did know about, and he knew he signed his own fundraising agreement with the party. And it's interesting that when this was all revealed, I know I have my own fundraising agreement with the party, but I've been ignoring Hillary's because we have our own way of doing things. And he did have his own way of doing things. And that way didn't involve funneling of any money to the party at the national level or the state level until very, very, very late in the process, and to individual candidates. Although I don't know how else he would have done it. If he's holding himself separate from the party, that's the only way he's going to have available to do it, is to individual candidates. And that's the way ideally you would want somebody from the outside to do it. It's just a very time-consuming process, and you can't just jumpstart it and not come away in the end with having supported a dozen people and not much more. That's all that was ever going to come out of that without a year's worth of planning for something different. Okay, another comment here. Let's see. Michael also saying, maybe this is generational. I think I'm about your age, and I don't care much about the party as an end. I care about issues. I think it probably is largely generational, too. And at a certain generational point, the party had a lot more to do with where things came out and saved a number of people. That's absolutely true. From disasters in the past, and stood as a bulwark against others. Meredith also saying here, well, I also like much about Bernie Sanders, but not all. To me, he is a one-trick pony. The voting itself not rigged. He lost. Question, another comment from her, did Brazil talk with the Clinton campaign? And that I don't know. It's not in this excerpt. That's why we're going to have to get this book, I guess, and read it and see what we make of it. I don't like having to read books. I like it when people tell me quick and dirty. And then I will read you what should be a 5-minute excerpt and make it an hour. But there's a lot to discuss in this. As I said, there's also a lot to discuss tomorrow. And this was a bad day to have done this. I should have remembered when I started out on this that I shouldn't have focused on just this one thing. But I can't help it. It's a stream of consciousness show. That's where my consciousness went. I say it's a bad day for it because the after show is not following us today. Normally, I would say, don't worry about it. All the big stories of the day will be cleaned up and captured for you by the after show, and it's not happening today. Justice a little bit under the weather, I believe, and they'll have some fantastic programming in its place, no doubt. And I've got a little bit. Do I have anything that I can describe for you today? I'm not sure what's coming up, but whether it's a replay of an old after show or some other programming, but I can promise you at least good progressive programming for the rest of the day on Netroots Radio. You never have to worry about that. Okay, I'm behind in our outro music. Missed my cue. What about tomorrow? Well, assuming events don't overtake us once again, and it will be Friday and time for some rage tweeting, no doubt about that. There's more about the tax bill. We'll allegedly find out what the hell is in it, at least for the time being. There's more about Russia and their hacking. There's more about the targets that they had outside the United States. There's more about how much influence they had outside of social media and in real life space. I just quickly wanted to, I knew this would come up somewhere along the line. Once we found out that they were pushing people using their fake Facebook accounts to push people to rallies in real space, I knew somewhere along the line they would test this. If I can get people to go to rallies, let's you and him fight. Why don't we? I'll arrange for competing rallies of opposite sides of the same issue to coincide in the same place and see if we can actually make Americans kill or maim each other at a distance. Spooky action at a distance. Wow. That might be a great Freudian slip. We'll explore some of that tomorrow as well, plus everything new that we're learning about what's happening in the Mueller probe. I assume there'll be some weekend teasers and maybe even a Friday news dump because he works on a more traditional schedule, this Mueller guy does. We'll see, or whether he keeps us hanging over the weekend. In the meantime, stay tuned for more great progressive programming right here.
From Daily Coast Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Thanks for listening today. I know it was a tough read, but I don't see how we could have skipped it. I initially thought about saving it for tomorrow, but that's just going to be the biggest news on the progressive and Democratic front. I'm glad we had the opportunity to discuss it. I don't know if we satisfied anyone with it, but we'll be back tomorrow. Stay tuned.